Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. Every company has a story to tell, from the small startup to the large enterprise, and everything in between. This is one of them. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hello, everybody. This is Sean Martin, and you're very welcome for a new story here with our good friends at Imperva, who do all kinds of things to help organizations protect their data at every place you could ever imagine it being, and in any way that it might be misused or abused. And they do some really good work, a lot, especially in the area of research as well. And I'm thrilled to have two guests on with me today, Gabi and Erez. We're going to look at the world of retail, the world of app security and API security, and some of the trends in this space and the risks that retailers face, especially as we approach all the days which seem to be earlier and more frequent of deals and specials and sales and all this stuff that get people to buy, but also attract the not so fun people to engage as well. So thank you both for being here. I'm gonna ask each of you to kind of share a few words about your roles and what you're up to at Imperva, and then we'll go from there. So Gabi, you first, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sean, for having us. My name's Gabi. I work as a content manager for Imperva's threat research team. So I get to work with a lot of really awesome people and dive into some really cool data and work on some great projects like this one with Erez.
And Erez.
So my name is Hasson. I'm an application security strategist here at Imperva. I've been working on the e-commerce reports for quite a few years now, and specialize in application security, as I've said, and bot management and client-side security.
Perfect. So give me, and Erez, I'll start with you on this. Kind of give me the history of this research and the reporting. I don't know if you can harken back to the early days. What prompted you to start collecting this data and analyzing this data, and what's the objective of the report?
Sure. We've known for years that the e-commerce industry is probably, unfortunately, the hottest target for bad actors, cyber attackers, and for a good reason. The amount of incentives in this industry is very high. You have your user accounts that have a bunch of sensitive information in them, whether it be personal information, whether it be payment information. You have a lot of value in the goods that are being sold on these websites. So limited availability items like sneakers or collector's items, for example. And we've also seen specific circumstances, I would say, that have caused greater chaos for these specific situations. So take, for example, the chip shortage back in 2020 and 2021 that resulted in a shortage in GPUs, graphic processing units, basically graphics cards for gamers or PlayStation 5s that have become very sought after by a lot of people and resulted in bots going after them. So there's always constantly new incentives for attackers to go after e-commerce. So this has prompted us to really look back ahead of the holiday shopping season at the trends that we've seen over the past 12 months each year and collect all that data to educate online retailers on the matter.
Yeah. And there's no question bad actors follow the money, and there's plenty of money here in the retail space. And but that's not any different, at least from my perspective, from the retailers themselves trying to find new markets, new customers, new ways to sell new things, and make higher margins and protect the revenue that they do generate. And that says, let me turn to tech, let me turn to processes and build an ecosystem of things that allows me to do that, reach more people and get more money. And so, Gabi, I don't know if you can share kind of an overview, and maybe Erez, you have some points as well, some of the changes you've seen just in the retail tech ecosystem and tech stack?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a lot of like just general changes and trends this year in terms of the attacks that we're seeing. Obviously, there's a huge rise in business logic and application DDoS that we'll get into. But then also, and I know you have some things to add here, but there's also the earlier it's getting earlier in the season that we're starting to see these drops and these releases, and the holiday shopping season is really just extending out now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Sean, you put it pretty nicely there, is that the retailers are doing a lot of these efforts to reach more customers, just to do more, to provide a better user experience. And as a result, we're seeing what we like to call the modernization of web applications, which results in more APIs being used, more resources being added to websites like JavaScript, various services like chat service to be able to reach out to your customers to support them. And all of these just expand the attack surface, whether it be more APIs, just handling sensitive data and resulting in just a greater attack surface, or more resources that results in more opportunities for bad actors to plant some malicious scripts and skim credit card information, for example. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I know we were talking earlier before we started recording that this buy now, pay later trend that we're seeing a lot of, and that's just one point in the life cycle of the customer engagement. And earlier, Gab, you mentioned the attacks on logic, which tell me that it's more than just searching and seeking out a vulnerability in an API. It's understanding maybe that vulnerability in connection to the end-to-end process of how a transaction is completed from customer acquisition to actually collecting the money and putting it in the right account, right?
Yeah, exactly. Business logic attacks this year were the most common attack we saw. They made up almost 50% of all the attacks that we saw on retail sites. And I mean, that just goes to show that attackers are trying to find any access point they can. And rather than doing these other attacks, in a lot of cases, they're just trying to exploit the actual logic that the site has and trying to get in and figure out what they can find, whether it's changing prices to get things cheaper or making accounts or whatever they can do, just exploiting the site's logic itself.
And Erez, or Gabi, either of you, maybe share a few examples, because as I'm sitting here putting myself in the shoes of SecOps, engineering, DevOps, the IT infrastructure team, fraud team, perhaps. How do those teams spot that something is going awry? I mean, you can test applications before you deploy them, but when something's in flight, it might not be as easy to spot some of these things.
Yeah, I would say it's tricky. It's a good question. Because one of those, for an example, one of those business logic abuses that you could see it's called new account fraud, where you would basically create a bunch of new accounts. You can obviously automate that using a bot in order to abuse the new user benefits that new account would get. You would get some websites will offer you 20% off for your first purchase. So we've seen cases where bots were being used to create a massive amount of accounts and use those for those benefits. Then the security teams would have to have some sort of an account takeover or an account fraud prevention solution in order to be able, because a lot of the times you have to find the anomalies. You have to find, the exact same IPs, creating a bunch of accounts and things like that. So it's a lot of heavy lifting for a fraud team.
And for me, I like marketing. That's just a sign of a successful campaign. All those new accounts.
It's a good point, by the way, that causes a lot of pain for the marketing teams, because it skews up their metrics and analytics. They cannot make proper decisions when they're based off of skewed metrics that bots have created for them. So that's another very interesting point.
Yeah. And Gabi, any other examples on the logic flow trend?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's examples where attackers will go in and adjust the prices of things so they can get things cheaper, or they'll exploit the functionality of the site. And that's why we talk about, layered security, because like Erez said, it's just really finding the anomalies there and finding the differences. And in some cases that's one solution, in some cases that is another, and you need all that layered security there to catch that.
And I'm going to stick with big picture here for a moment. I mean, retail isn't the only industry that faces fraud and the abuse that bots unleash on them. But what perhaps makes retail such a prime target beyond just there's a lot of money? Do you see changes in maturity levels? Do you see lack of or less, I don't want to say less skill, but perhaps less team and resources to apply to protect against their infrastructure? What makes them such a prime target?
Well, obviously, like you said, the financial reason, but I think on top of that, there's lots of access points. I mean, especially with retail sites, you have payment processes, you have APIs, you have all these sort of access points that an attacker can use to try to find a way in. I mean, you might have, personal information in terms of accounts that people are creating, or any other sort of information that they can get out of that. And there's a lot of opportunity in the retail industry for different kinds of bots. I mean, scraping, scalping, like anything you can do to try to get to not only try to steal products, but also steal information from that site.
Exactly. I would say it's that creativity of the amount of things that you can achieve using bots or different techniques, like buying products that you can then sell for a significant profit, and you can take advantage of certain situations, as we've mentioned, with the chip shortage and the PlayStation 5s. And even when COVID started, we've seen people hoarding toilet paper and other commodities because people were looking for them. And basically, it's just a very opportunistic kind of industry, or there's always going to be something new. And as we've said, that they try to delight their customers, to provide a good user experience and good buying journey. And as a result, the attack surface expands because there's a lot of stuff that you can exploit.
Which to me says that a lot of different ways bad actors can find a way in. They're going to use the least path of, or look for the least path of resistance, and one that has not just resistance, but doesn't require a lot of funds and effort on their part. But that hasn't slowed down their own innovations, right? What do we see in terms of bot sophistication? They're still progressing, even if retailers aren't in that regard.
Yeah, that's unfortunately correct. For the third year in a row, we're seeing an increase in bot sophistication. It has gone as far as 53% of the bad bots that we're seeing are now classified as advanced, which is the most sophisticated type of bot that we see. And there's a good reason for that, because again, this is a very profitable industry for them. And bots, you have to understand that you have to look at these as a business. They are a business for these bot operators. So the bigger their profits, the more they're going to put into the sophistication of these bots. And these bots will go through the entire process. It's not just like a script anymore. The bots, if you want to buy a certain product, like a sneaker or a collector's item, they would first of all query the product page. So they start with the product page. They're looking for inventory. They want to make sure that they have inventory, and then they would go and put that into the cart. Some of them are able to overcome CAPTCHAs, and they would go through the entire purchasing process. So they're not just scripts anymore. They're programs that people are putting a lot of effort and money into, which really turns this into a cat and mouse game. So a bot management, when you look at bot management, it has to be able to adapt to these attacks that constantly shift.
And so there's a lot of points in there. You started earlier with the account creation. I don't know where that fits into your scenario, but I don't know if they look for inventory first and okay, they have 50 of these limited edition shoes that they made. They only have 25 left. I'm going to create 25 accounts and buy, and then reduce the price and buy them. How does an organization begin to see that that's actually happening? So some of it's transaction based, some of it is just general app usage. Some of it we can see, like the query of the inventory, might be traffic related. Anything interesting in your research that helps organizations kind of say, here are the things I need to be looking for, and any trends that you saw from this most recent year for that?
I would say that any organization that prepares to have such a big sale or selling a limited edition item at this point in time, they have to prepare and expect to see bots that are going to target their inventory. And it's not just that, it's a combination of strategies that you need to prepare for. Because yes, they're going to see a lot of bots, but they're also going to be seeing a lot of legitimate human users that are very interested in getting their hands on that latest product. So these organizations must be prepared to properly analyze and differentiate their traffic between those humans and those bots. And it is for them, I think at first a lot of organizations might not understand, because they might say, we have sold a product, right? I mean, for us, we don't see it as a problem. The inventory is gone. Yes, eventually a bot bought them, but for them, they made their money from the sale. But there's a lot of issues that go beyond that. So, for example, these bots buying them are gonna cause a lot of outrage within legitimate human users that are going to be saying, and we've seen this many times, we'll go on Twitter or X nowadays, go online and just complain about a certain retailer. We were not able to buy these because of bots. And that outrage results in just negative consequences for that business, because they get bad PR. And then one other interesting thing that you could also look at is the total value of the cart. So if I was to buy, let's say, a PlayStation, I would usually probably pair that with another controller or a couple more video games for me to play as I actually start using it. If a bot is interested in certain inventory, it will only get one item and that's it. So that results in net losses for the retailer. So eventually I think retailers might not see it, but then they start seeing it with complaints from customers. And as I said, this was in the past. I believe that nowadays, if you are a retailer that you're planning such a big sales events or limited edition events, you have to be ready to face bots, and you have to be able to differentiate the human users from them, because the customer experience is key for those e-commerce websites.
Yeah, Erez is exactly right. I mean, if you're a retailer that's doing one of these drops, I mean, you have to be prepared for it, and that's a combination of both front end and back end things that you can do, right? Because I know that for example, like in some sneaker drops, they'll have signups ahead of time, or you have to like get on a list and you have to go through a lottery and all that sort of thing in order to even be eligible to buy one of these products that's on this big drop. And then on the back end, I mean, like Erez said, you can also look at what people have in their carts. You know, are they buying a combination of things to actually play the game, or are they just buying like 5 PlayStations, you know, or things like that. And then also looking at like the activity, what are they doing? What sort of actions and interactions are they doing with the page? And then, you know, for example, like in our protection, we look at the IP and where that's coming from, and has it been involved in other things in the past? And then we have a risk. We like analyze the risk of that IP address. Could it be a bot or not based on its activity? And so things like that, where you're tracking these users and seeing what they're doing is really important.
Super interesting. And I want to stick with the report for another moment. And I'm just wondering, are there any other highlights from it? I'm thinking in terms of the global nature of commerce, but then also the local nature of it. You want to make sure that that who's buying it is allowed to buy it. And then there's things like I don't know if it's necessarily regulatory. I guess it ultimately is a regulatory, but digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, organizations need to think about some of this stuff too. So any other points from the report that kind of highlight the global yet local areas of business?
Yeah, yes. I would say that you mentioned regulatory. So a big one is PCI DSS for everyone who's accepting or processing payments. And PCI DSS have in 2022 come up with version 4, which has a lot of significant updates to it. And there are two interesting requirements within that PCI DSS, requirement 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, that relate specifically to payment pages and the scripts that are allowed to operate and run on the client side within those payment pages. And the reason for this change is that the PCI DSS acknowledge attacks such as MageCart, which take advantage of the resources that are loaded on the client side, which are basically is the user's side. So your browser, whatever is loaded on your browser, these attackers can exploit. And within even a single line of JavaScript code, they can skim data from your web browser. So whenever you input your credit card number or even your login information, that could go to an attacker. And it's essentially a single record data breach, which amounts, because it's very kind of stealthy in its nature, it'll amount to a massive data breach eventually. So that really mandated PCI DSS to update in version 4 and make sure that retailers should now focus on managing scripts and manage changes to payment pages and ensure that nothing like that can happen.
Yeah, no, this is a really good point. In our data specifically, in the last year, the average amount of transactions on an average day that we see coming through payment processes is about 1.1 million. So, I mean, we're seeing a huge volume of transactions, and that's just what we're seeing here. And obviously this goes up and down depending on the season, but like just an average day, 1.1 million payments. So this is a huge deal, and it's definitely something that needs to be protected and needs to be I guess protected.
Yeah. So talk to me. I picture two. I mean, there's always the middle part that's gray and mushy, but I see two types of organizations. You have your behemoths that operate globally. They have a ton of inventory, ton of customers, many products and apps and APIs to make it all work. And so that's one environment. And they do some of these big drops, let's say, right? And huge sales. And then you have, as you work your way down, smaller organizations that use a lot of, I'll say, common or standard infrastructure and a lot of pre-built components. And they may offer specials or sales, but may not expect to have tremendous amounts of traffic. So these two different environments clearly operate differently, but then also need to consider the risks differently. And so I'm going to start with the lower end, because many of them might say, I don't do big drops. I don't expect millions of people to come in and overwhelm my site, but that doesn't mean that they're not at risk, right? So let's speak to those folks first. How can they, as they prepare for the season, how can they prepare for and begin to plan or shore up their security posture to better protect the revenue that they generate?
It's a good point. I mean, the smaller ones cannot always also allow themselves to, they don't always can invest in a lot of strengthening of their security posture. But they still should be expecting, you've mentioned that they don't always do these small drops or the product drops. So we have seen actually small retailers that do these product drops, and they usually, unfortunately, don't go well for them. Where we've seen drops getting canceled, and they have to redo them without actually letting go of the inventory. But it actually goes to show that they are aware, because the fact that they go and audit the purchases and see who bought them means that they are still aware. So for specific product drops, you definitely have to verify who's purchasing them. And we've seen people adding more measures to prevent such fraud. So, for example, make sure that people have to have an account in order to purchase a specific item, or limit the amount of items that they can put in the cart to 1 or 2, depending on your policies. And then, as I said, even after that, it's recommended to go and audit these purchases. And this is strictly talking about the limited product drops. As for the greater scheme of like security posture, you have to plan in advance and make sure that if you are doing a big event such as this, maybe you should look at having a waiting room type of web page on your website that puts you in a queue in order to control the number of people going in. And as someone who's had to come in and buy those limited edition items, because I'm a big nerd that loves all these collector's items myself, so I much rather have a queuing system, or as Gabi mentioned, a raffle, than knowing that it was whoever gets there first, because you're never going to get there first before a bot. So it's much better to have it as a raffle or as a waiting room. So I would recommend to kind of plan in advance, understand what you're looking to do. If you're going to have a big event, prepare for traffic. If you know that you're adding a new capability to your website, something we haven't talked about is even small businesses today have gift card options. So whenever you have a gift card option, you would usually pair that with a gift card balance checking page, where you would go in, input your gift card number, and it'll tell you how much balance you have on it. We have seen bots basically brute forcing that in order to find validated gift card combinations and steal money off those gift cards. So you have to really consider every functionality that you're adding to your website and kind of plan around that, whether it be rate limit the amount of requests you can put into that, or specific other techniques that you can do to limit the numbers or the abuse. Kind of think in advance as to how attackers can exploit the functionalities that you're going to be putting on your website.
Yeah, the gift card one is one that lasts well after the holidays as well, because those were given as gifts.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you can't let your guard down after. So
true,
Gabi. So I made a number of assumptions that were not necessarily correct. I didn't think smaller companies would do big drops because they didn't have the resources to do something like that. But it actually makes sense when you think about it, right? That's the way for them to actually generate more revenue, because they can do that. So are there any other misconceptions that maybe I might make or others might make as they think about this problem?
Well, I don't know if this is necessarily a misconception, but whether or not you're a small company, a large company, whatever, I think sometimes people can feel like, oh, well, I'm not big enough to be a target, or not big enough to be attacked. And everyone is. And so my advice for a smaller company in a slightly different direction would be to just stay on top of security and stay on top of vulnerabilities, because there's so many different resources and things that you're using as a small company, especially a retail site, whether it's a WordPress site or some sort of payment processing API, whatever it is that you're using to build your website, to build your functionality. Vulnerabilities are going to pop up in that, and just stay on top of it and update things when you can, because that's always a way for attackers to get in, and they will exploit that. So,
and as we begin to wrap here, I'll let either of you note any other highlights from the report that you'd like. But I'd also like to maybe hear from you a story of how an Imperva customer engaged with you and said, we think we might, there could be, we don't know, something bad happening here. We don't know how to really locked down that it is bad, or we do know it's bad, but we have no idea how to refactor the app, restructure the infrastructure, put protections in place that don't destroy performance or customer experience. We still want to offer what we offer, but not impact that. So can either of you describe kind of what those conversations sound like? I'm not looking for customer names necessarily, but just what that engagement sounds like so people listening can kind of resonate with this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Erez go more into the customer side of things, but in terms of things from the report, I mean, we talked earlier about business logic attacks, and like we said, one of those is like account takeover, where you're creating these accounts or taking over existing accounts and trying to abuse the functionalities within that. And one really interesting thing that we've seen this year is huge rise in application DDoS. I mean, it went up 417% from last year, which is just a crazy number. And especially around the holiday shopping season. I mean, every year we're getting into that now where we're just seeing these like massive upticks in application DDoS attacks. And one thing that I find really interesting is the connection between business logic and DDoS, because, for example, with account takeover is one of them specifically that we see where an attack will start off as an account takeover attack, and then it'll turn into a DDoS attack because attackers, especially using bots, are trying so many account combinations and login combinations so quickly that it's just completely overwhelming the system. And so it becomes a DDoS attack, even though that wasn't the attacker's initial intention. So whether or not the attack is something that the attacker like intended to or thought about conducting on this site, I mean, it was an unintended consequence. So you always have to be prepared for these sort of things, and you always have to have the security and the ability to defend against these attacks.
And I'm going to pause before you take over, Erez, because Gabi, a deeper dive on the DDoS, the distributed denial of service, for folks. Many listening to the show probably know, but some may not know what that is. And there's the accidental or unintended unavailability of services because of something a bot is doing. But then I've also heard stories of intended or intentional competitive denial of services, right?
Absolutely.
I've heard in terms of buying flights and taking up seats on planes and things like that. So can you, a moment to help retailers understand that risk?
Yeah, of course.
DDoS.
Yeah. So basically a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, is where an attacker is sending so many requests, whether intentionally or unintentionally in the case of the ATO attacks, but so many requests to the site that it just completely overwhelms the site, and then no one can access it, right? So they're denying service for the legitimate customers. And so this, like you said, I mean, can be done for competitive purposes. I mean, we see retail sites that get targeted a lot by DDoS. And like I said, I mean, sometimes that is the unintended consequence of another attack that just went too big. Or, I mean, it can be for competitive purposes because, you know, attackers want someone to go to their site instead of another site. So they're going to take down that other site and make people not able to access that, so that they'll go to the competitor instead. And then sometimes it's just done, you know, for something it could be hacktivism. I mean, for example, in Israel recently, we saw when attacks started on Israeli sites on October 7th, we saw a rise in attacks on retail sites too. Now, you know, that obviously that's not part of any sort of like war effort or whatever, but I mean, attackers were just trying to get anything in Israel they could just to hit them hard. So there's a lot of reasons for DDoS and a lot of reasons for attackers to do it, but it is a really common attack, and it's up, I mean, almost 420% from the last year. So definitely something people need to be aware of. Yeah,
absolutely. Any impact on the experience is an impact on the business for sure.
Exactly.
Erez, any additional highlight from the report that you wanted to flag? And then I'm really interested in the customer engagement from Imperva's perspective.
Absolutely. I think I can give an example that kind of encompasses everything that we've talked about and packages it nicely. So there's a big global retailer that chose, and this goes back to the story of retailers doing launches on Black Friday, to do a very big launch on Black Friday a couple of years ago of collector's items. And sure enough, they had bots all over. So we have seen, and they reached it out to us in advance, and we had bot management running. And in the first 15 minutes of that launch, we mitigated 9 million bot requests. to that specific product page. So that goes really back to that conversation of product launches, and to, if that would have not been mitigated, it would have been a distributed denial of service attack. It would have taken down the infrastructure. And the same global retailer has reached out to us recently because they are doing these launches all the time. And this goes back to the story of early holiday shopping, because they launched a product around 2 weeks ago, so fairly early in the season. And they were, as I said, they were preparing for more bots to come for it, and more bots with new techniques. So these bots were trying to manipulate the fingerprints, which are essentially what part of the mechanisms that detect bots. And with the help of our product team and the security team, they were able to create new rules for them and mitigate that attack. So I think that's kind of a nice example that ties it all together.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And the interesting thing that I'm picking up throughout this whole conversation, as I maybe try to wrap up here, is as technical teams, it's easy to get into the technicalities of how have I built my infrastructure, how have I built my apps, what APIs am I using, what APIs am I exposing, and not really looking at the connection to that, from that to business logic, and from that to the impact on the customer experience, and from that the impact on revenue, right? Recurring revenue, customers coming back. And it's there may be options to build better protections into the apps and then the client facing things and in the back end on the infrastructure. But having a partner like Imperva to help really understand the full end to end, right? What's the entire customer journey? How do bots and other human driven bad actors insert themselves into that process? And how can you at scale protect your apps and your APIs and your data wherever it is without impacting performance or the user experience? And so let the legitimate through and keep the bad stuff out at scale. Takes a lot of knowledge beyond just API security. And I hear from you and clearly in your example, that relationship that you have with your customers really takes things to the next level. So I mean, as always, fantastic to chat with you, and interesting to hear some of the findings from this year and some of the trends from previous years as well. So all I can say is hopefully people are listening and recognizing that the risk exists, and there are options to mitigate it and keep your customers happy. So Gabi and Erez, thank you so much. Any final words before we wrap up here?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I mean, the only last thing I want to say is that recently there was this release of this attack called HTTP2, which is a new form of DDoS where you can basically multiply the requests that are coming from one specific device. And I mean, I talked about the rise in application DDoS and how prevalent that is and how much it's increased just this year. And that's pre HTTP2. And so this is something that's just going to get worse, and we're going to see bigger and bigger attacks. So prepare for it, be aware of it. And it is out there.
Yeah, we didn't get to touch on all the legacy stuff that exists. All right, Erez, any final thoughts?
I would probably focus on, and this is not a legacy stuff, it's probably more, it's more new, but as I've said, Mage Carton client-side attacks, before the regulations are put in place and become mandatory in March of 2025, the PCI DSS, we are expecting to see an increase in attacks as attackers make sure to exploit it as much as they can before more and more organizations are mandated to actually deploy client-side protection.
Yeah, and we all know, sitting here on the podcast, know that compliance isn't security, but it is a way to gain a baseline understanding and then to begin to prepare So you can take it to the ultimate maturity level, but a good place to start and right around the corner. So good to prepare. Well, thank you again, both of you, for joining me for this story, and thanks to the Imperva team for continuing to do the work you do so I can shop safely online along with everybody else. And of course, there'll be links in the show notes to access some materials from Imperva so you can learn more about what they do and how they do it, and to connect with Gabi and Erez as well on social, so you can have a chat with them and learn more about what's in the report, the additional stuff that we didn't cover. So thank you again, and see you all on the next one.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.